Removing Barriers is a four-part series that seeks to inform and inspire people of faith to understand the fight against racism. With an historical perspective coupled with personal witness and experience, the guests share their insights into the very prejudice that has plagued the nation and the world. Your program host is Father Jim Korda, president of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown.
Hello and welcome to our show, Removing Barriers. I'm Father Jim Korda. Joining me is Bishop George Murry, who is the chair of the Bishop's Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Father.
In this segment, we're going to focus on the 1984 pastoral letter that the black bishops presented, and it is entitled What We Have Seen and Heard, and it's a pastoral on evangelization. Before we actually talk about the document, let's go back to the title of it, What We Have Seen and Heard. Why did they select that particular title?
The bishops selected that title because they wanted to reflect the experience that they have had as Catholics, as African American Catholics, as priests, and as bishops in the United States in terms of this issue of evangelization. What we have seen and heard comes out of an earlier document from 1979, where the bishops issued a pastoral letter called Brothers and Sisters to Us. It was in that letter that the bishops said very clearly, racism is a sin that divides the human family, blots out the image of God among specific members of that family, and violates the fundamental human dignity of those called to be children of the same God. So the bishops were challenging racist attitudes and racist beliefs. Then the next question becomes, where do you go from there? The bishops raised racism as an important social issue in the country. How do we then begin to overcome racism? That led to the pastoral letter, What We Have Seen and Heard, and the focus on evangelization. What changes hearts? Jesus changes hearts. It's the encounter with Jesus that opens us to the possibility of living a different life, opens us to conversion. So that's what the bishops are getting at in that document, What We Have Seen and Heard. How do we open ourselves to the experience of the Lord and allow Him to touch us and change us and make us new?
You know, it's interesting when you use the word evangelization. I always think of that one-on-one experience really taken from the life of Jesus, because all of His experiences with people were really one-on-one. Why did the black bishops focus on evangelization instead of focusing on a pastor on racism? We know it's all tied in together, but why this broader umbrella of evangelization? How important was that to focus on that?
I think it was extremely important because of the fact that they had already focused on racism per se in that earlier document, Brothers and Sisters to Us. In this follow-up document, they wanted to look at different ways that we could challenge racism both individually and collectively and institutionally. And what they were trying to clarify was that the more the gospel becomes a part of our lives, the more we are evangelized, the more open we become to loving everyone as a child of God.
And what has been the impact over these 30 plus years of the document since?
Well, that's a very good question because of the fact that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops did a study about 5 years ago of asking that question, what has been the impact? And the results of that study was not encouraging. Many of the people who responded said that they didn't see much of an impact from that document. And I think that that becomes the jumping off point, if you will, for this new ad hoc committee against racism. Because what we want to do with the new committee is have a sustained effort. Throughout American history, bishops have made various statements. What we want to do now is say racism is a serious problem in our country. We need a long-term and sustained effort. We cannot simply make statements. We have to take actions that will help people to learn more about each other, listen to each other, come to know each other, and overcome this sin.
And I think another thing is that we do learn from one another. And let's go back to the feast day that they promulgated the pastoral letter on, and that is the Feast of St. Peter Claver. Why do we go back to him and lift him up when we talk about this sin of racism? Because
of the fact that Peter Claver gave his life to work with African slaves. Peter Claver came to South America, to Cartagena, and he discovered that these slaves were being brought in from Africa and no one was caring for them spiritually. And I think that Peter Claver was very aware of the fact that the Jesuits were originally founded as a missionary order. 85% of the Jesuits around the world are involved in education now. But Ignatius founded the Jesuit order to be missionaries. So he went to Cartagena as a missionary, and he saw these people who were in need of basic care, food, clothing, shelter, but also in need of the gospel. And he devoted his life to caring for those slaves. And when he died, the people in Cartagena, the slave owners, had a big celebration for him, but the slaves also came and they carried his body through the street. He's an example of outreach to people who have been brushed aside because of racial prejudice.
In our last 2 minutes of our time together, let's talk about that whole concept of preaching and witness, because we know as Christians, and especially as priests, our role is to preach the gospel and to witness to that. How do we combine those two together in a powerful way to address this sin of racism?
First of all, we have to admit that it is a problem in our society. I think that there is a great deal of denial. Some of that denial is rooted in hope. People are hoping that things will get better. But the fact of the matter is that there are many people, whether they be African American or Hispanic or Asian or Native American, who are the victims of injustice because of their race. We have to open our eyes to see that. Then secondly, we have to, through the strength of the gospel, through the strength of the Eucharist that we receive, we have to challenge that and begin by making that personal decision that I am not going to act in a racist way. And then that moves out to our institutions.
Thank you. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
There's a lot of violence in the world right now.
I just see people shooting and car wrecks that sometimes were on purpose.
What do you think the power of God could do in our world?
Change some of the people's minds and how they act.
We need to love our neighbors and love our enemies.
And love each other. That's what I think.
My name is Sister Murry Claudina, and I run a home for abandoned children. I want to take care of children who have no parents, because luckily I come from a very loving family. There are 8 of us. And I remember when one of my cousins got sick and she called my mom and said, "Mom, the doctor has said that I might not have too long to live. Will you please raise my 3 children for me?" I remember we had a meeting at home and my dad called a meeting and my mom was explaining to all of us. And my father said, this powerful word, he said, "We already have 8. What is 3 more?" We learn to care for each other, to love each other, to fight among each other, to make up, to forgive, to just to be a family. And I think that's what I learned from home, and I wanted to share that with children who do not have that love and that opportunity just to know what a family is all about.
Welcome back to our show. Joining me now is Adrienne Curry. Welcome.
Thank you.
In our first segment, we basically had an overview of the 1984 pastoral letter on evangelization that 10 black bishops wrote 30 plus years ago, entitled What We Have Seen and Heard. And in this segment, we're basically going to focus on part one of the document. But what I'd like us to talk about, first of all, is this document still relevant today and why?
It is still relevant today because when it was written, a lot of people didn't read it. It wasn't promoted as other pastoral letters. And so a lot of people never heard of it. And so it's important today because it talks about the gifts of the African American community.
And I'd like to specifically get into those gifts because that first part of the document is called The Gifts We Share.
Yes.
So let's enumerate some of those gifts and we'll discuss those.
Okay.
What would be one of the first gifts that you would see?
Our spirituality. Our spirituality is vibrant. It's lively. It varies in different communities. It's contemplative. It's spirit-filled. It's holistic. It's everything to us.
It's interesting when we talk about spirituality and the black community. I would almost see those two words as synonymous.
Oh yes.
And for me, I certainly enjoy and look forward to experiencing that spirituality. There are those, however, that do not. Would that be racist on their part, or is that just because that's their spirituality?
It's not racist on their part because it varies within the black community. We have black Catholic churches who would prefer a traditional mass. My home parish in Chicago, we have a very lively mass. We have a gospel choir. We have a lot of instruments. There's a lot of fellowship at the Sign of Peace. And not all parishes do that. So it varies within the black community. So no, it's not racist. It's just what you're accustomed to.
And let's talk about, I think, one of the premier gifts in most, if not every community, but in particular in the African American community, and that is family.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Family is very important, and it's not just your immediate family, it's extended family. Every black person I know has play brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, cousins. You know, we just take people in. And it's always been that way. You have a group of people who is part of your immediate family, and then you have other people that you grew up with or were neighbors or what have you, and they're all part of the family.
Let's talk about family values and how crucial that is in any family situation, that the values that we have basically are rooted in centuries way back, but why is it important for us to always go back to that?
It's the family, the black family has been fractured so much, starting from slavery times. You know, people were enslaved, families were broken up, things happened. Even most recently, if you were a poor family, the father couldn't be living in the home because the family couldn't collect benefits. So there's always been a war in society over the black family. But that doesn't stop people from doing what they need to do to keep that family alive and well.
You spent many years in social action in the church. The one word that comes to mind when I think about social action is that whole sense and the right of freedom.
Yes.
Freedom has not always been something that the African American community enjoyed. And still today, it's difficult. Let's talk about that, and why is that so crucial for us to understand that?
I think that's where Scripture comes in. Because, you know, in the Old Testament, you got Daniel in the lion's den, you've got Moses leading his people free. A lot of the spirituals came out of that. Mm-hmm. And those songs have sustained us for many years. And that's very important. And in the black community, we feel like if one person is enslaved, everyone is. You know, we all have to be free for us to be equal.
You know, the other word that comes to mind that kind of piggybacks that is that whole sense of reconciliation. We have to be reconciled with one another, but also with the larger community in the world. That is difficult sometimes, especially when we look at the issues of racism and those things that affect our freedom in our world today.
Yes, and a lot of times when people talk about, they don't want to talk about racism. They don't want to talk about things that separate other people. And it's important to talk about it. It's important to listen when a person of color is talking about racism and not just dismiss it. Because there's a saying, you have to walk a mile in someone's shoes to understand them. You just can't poo-poo something like that. If I tell you something and I feel like I've been offended, don't dismiss it.
Sure. Let's, in our last few minutes now, talk about ecumenism, because that is in that first part of the pastoral letter. And they talk about the African American community being really a bridge to people of other faiths, of Catholics with other Christian denominations. Why has that been, and why is that whole Christian spirituality and ecumenism so fundamental?
A lot of times when people talk about the black church, they're not talking about black Catholics, because we're not. Actually, we're a lot in numbers compared to some denominations, but they don't consider black Catholics as being part of the black church because of the structure of the church. But when it comes to our music and everything else, we are. And a lot of times, I know in Chicago, some of the big Protestant churches, the ministers will say, if it wasn't for the Catholics, we wouldn't have a church. So we're everywhere.
Well, Adrienne Curry, thank you so much for enlightening us on this wonderful and relevant document. In our next segment, we're going to talk with somebody further about part 2, but we thank you for being with us on this show. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
There's a lot of violence in the world right now.
I just see people shooting and car wrecks that sometimes were on purpose.
What do you think the power of God could do in our world?
Change some of the people's minds and how they act.
We need to love our neighbors and love our enemies.
And love each other. That's what I think.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
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 That's Maryknoll. That's Maryknoll.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Father Ed Noga. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
In our previous segments, we've been talking about the 1984 pastoral letter on evangelization that 10 black bishops put together. We also want to focus, I think, now in this segment on part 2 of that document, which is basically the call of God to his people. So it deals with vocations, the laity, permanent diaconate, RCIA, those kinds of things. But before we get into that, what is so important for us to realize when we're talking about evangelization and also this whole sin of racism? Does it work together at all?
Oh, absolutely. I think that when we work in our parishes with evangelization and we're trying to put together committees and groups to keep opening the door to all of God's people, racism kind of creeps in, and not through the back door, I think, but through the front door by our attitudes. I know, Father, that in growing up, I don't know how else to say it, but I did not really have to encounter another person of another color until I went to high school. I grew up in a neighborhood which, wasn't planned to be that way, but we were just there. We were with our group, and you just didn't mix. Today, that's much different, but I think what it reminds me of when I think about that always is that when we grow up specifically in one neighborhood with one family, and that sometimes we get a little jaded in our attitudes, and things that aren't true but stereotypical can easily infiltrate how we think and how we act towards other people. That certainly is in the church too.
Let's take another step to that and look at that whole area of vocations and priesthood. Obviously, in many areas of our country, the black population of priests is larger in some areas than others, but it's not as large as the white population is. And yet, this is not a white church, this is a universal church. But why do we have such a increase in vocations in the African American communities as opposed to the white communities?
Well, I think one of the things that's real important is realizing that sometimes our notion of mission may be a little jaded because we think, well, we're helping other people. When in fact now I think we're realizing that what we would call in the past minority communities are really kind of the missionaries to us. And I think maybe it's just a matter of realizing that, of acknowledging that, and really celebrating that, because that's the future of the church. I continually tell the folks at our parish, St. Pat's in Youngstown, that I'm in the minority now worldwide. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. That's just a reflection of the demographics of the world and the vocations of our church.
I'd like to get your input on the RCIA program. We know that in the rite of Christian initiation of adults, people are invited to learn more about the faith and really loved into the church. Are those numbers getting bigger in minority groups, in your estimation?
Well, interesting that you mentioned that. This year we have 5 individuals in RCIA, 1 Hispanic, 1 black, and 3 whites. And the discussions really take on I think, much better dialogue because of the fact that it's more diverse. I think the diversity brings giftedness that we sometimes forget about when we're just in our own group. So my parish, I don't think, is like representative of the demographics of everywhere, but certainly in our experience this year, those who have come in to help with RCIA and that see that there's a much better dialogue because of the diversity.
Let's talk about that whole area of Catholic education. We've been involved with that for many years. Why do we see more of an increase in our Catholic schools among the minority population and a decrease in many other populations? Does that make sense?
Well, that makes a lot of sense. It would seem that the history of what Catholic education has been, has become very much sought after by the minority community. Discipline, family life, good education, good skills, people skills, and so on. And you and I are products of that. Doesn't mean we're perfect at it, but we have a good attempt at it. And I think the folks in the minority community, the black community, really see that as a value. On the other side, which is probably the tougher question, it seems that in the white community, that which was important to our families, I think is still important, but people will constantly say to me, the public school system in my community is just as good, if not better, than any Catholic school I attended. So it's not an easy decision, I don't think, for parents. But it does point to the fact that there's maybe something missing, especially as we see our congregations, our parish congregations developing. There's something missing there often that came to us, I think, from the stream of Catholic education.
Let's go to another topic, and that is that whole area of worship and liturgy. Many parishes around the country enjoy different styles of worship. They're all Catholic, but they're different things that make it peculiar to their neighborhood or their area. Why is that important for Catholics to experience different cultures within the liturgy and within the worship of the church?
Well, I think it's extremely important, and I always enjoy when our Holy Father travels. You know, people will say that following Sunday, wow, did you see that liturgy that they had outdoors? Not just the numbers, 250,000 people, although that's great, but the culture and the enculturation worked into the liturgy. And I think parishes do that. We try to do that periodically also, both in music selection, also in guest musicians and that. I think it enriches our prayer life. I really do.
Going back to this whole sin of racism that is part of this whole series, why sometimes is that a hindrance to moving ahead as to what we really need to do? Why are some people still reticent to kind of take stands and make appeals and to embrace the need for equality?
Well, maybe part of the reason we get bogged down, if I could use that phrase, is that we don't even know how to have the conversation. I think sometimes just in sitting with people and just kind of learning where are you from, and I don't mean geographically, but tell me a little bit about your background and your family. People will often, myself included, walk away and say, good grief, basically families are the same. Why do we keep building these walls that say, well, yeah, we're kind of the same, but you're in a different experience. That experience enhances my experience. But I often feel in the limited engagements I have on issues like this, sometimes on a level like you and I are talking, people are just even afraid to learn how to talk to each other. That seems like, gosh, that's simple, but it's not being done, in my humble opinion.
Well, Father Ed Noga, thank you so much for being with us
on
this
episode.
Episode.
Thanks.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Removing Barriers was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father Jim Korda.